Good morning. Thank you for those songs, Brother Jeff, and thank you for the singing. I saw something so beautiful a moment ago. I want to share it with you. As we all partook of the bread that represents Christ's body, I looked up and I saw Christ's body. I saw bowed heads, people in reflection, thinking about the Lord and Savior, people who care deeply about being Christians. And I just want to say thank you for being those people here with me this morning. And so it doesn't really have a lot to do with the lesson, but it was awesome, and I wanted to share it with you. So this morning, I want to ask the question. I don't know how to introduce this, okay? So boom, there it is. There's the slide. Sufficient. A lot of times we wonder, am I good enough? You ever wonder that? I've spent my life wondering that, personally. And maybe some of you out there are super confident and you never wonder this. And good job. Maybe you can give me some pointers afterward. But usually we go through life and we have some doubts and some fears. Am I good enough? Am I able? Do I have the training to do this task in front of me? Do I have the skills to do what I'm trying to do? You know, when I held my first newborn in my arms, I knew I had never raised a kid before. Some of you can relate to that. Some of you can relate even though maybe you haven't gone through that. If you right now were holding your first baby in your arms, would you say, got this, no problem? Probably not. And when there's a living infant in your arms, you're thinking, this is so real. There's a human life here that I've got to keep alive. And not only that, but later as they grow up, teach them how to live life. And I don't even have that figured out for myself. And so it's a big moment. Am I good enough? I got to tell you, as a husband, I haven't always done the right things, and I haven't always been good enough. And that can weigh you down. Am I good enough to teach other people the gospel? I mean, I don't even live as well as I should. Can I teach somebody else and bring them on board? I don't know. Well, I don't know what you're facing today, but chances are there is something where you are maybe considering that you're not good enough. So we're going to ask 3 questions today. Who did God use to build the walls of Jerusalem? Who did God choose to be his people? Who's good enough? Who has the ability? All right. We know, if you're a Bible student, you know the Old Testament. Nehemiah was really the force that brought the building of the walls about. So that's not the right answer to the question. The right answer is, who was this guy? Who was Nehemiah? I'll tell you who he was. If you look in Nehemiah chapter 1, we find that he's a captive. Let's look at this story for a little bit. And what we want to do is kind of overview the story of Nehemiah, and then we'll go back and pull lessons out of it. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. It came to pass in the month of Chislev in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. So, as we set the stage here, Judah had been carried into captivity by Babylon years and years before. At this point, the Medo-Persian Empire has conquered Babylon, so these are captives. God's people are captives in the Medo-Persian Empire. When the king of Babylon came through, Nebuchadnezzar, he deported them. in several different waves. He had to come and conquer Jerusalem a number of times because they kept rebelling against him. And as he did that, he realized that what he needed to do was scatter them into many different geographical locations so they couldn't join together and continue rebelling. And so they were captives in the midst of a vast empire, now the Medo-Persian Empire. So who is Nehemiah? He's one of these captives that's been deported. That's the first thing we can learn about Nehemiah. And so there is a movement at this point to go back to Jerusalem. If you read in Ezra, just the book before this, we see that they have built the temple, but they still don't have walls to the city. And that's exactly what the news is that Nehemiah receives. It says in verse 3, they said to me, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down. Its gates are burned with fire. Now, I'm reading this because I want you to see Nehemiah's reaction. Is this bad news? Yes, it's bad news. How do you react to bad news? Nehemiah's reaction is over the top. So it was when I heard these words, now we're in verse 4, Nehemiah 1:4. When I heard these words that I sat down and wept and mourned for many days, and I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. And I said, I pray, Lord God of heaven, O great and awesome God, you keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and observe your commandments. Please let your ear be attentive and your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now. Day and night for the children of Israel, your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, that we have sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned. We have acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servants Moses. Remember, I pray, the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. It's in Deuteronomy. Had God done that? Yes, he had. Yes, he had. Verse 9, Nehemiah continues the quote. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though some of you were cast out to the farthest part of the heavens. Do they feel cast out to the farthest part of heavens, hundreds of miles away from Jerusalem? Yes, they do. So if you will return to me, no matter how far you've been cast out, yet I will gather them from there and bring them to the place which I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. And he goes on and basically is offering his repentance to God, to convince God to bring his people back to Jerusalem, just as he said he would in the law. Would you say Nehemiah took this news kind of hard? If you look here in chapter 2, he continues, and it came to pass in the month of Nisan in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. So the month of Nisan, and remember when we started in verse 1, it was the month of Chislev. That's 3 months, if you look at the Jewish calendar. So this fasting and praying, I take it as lasting 3 months. And then it becomes his turn to go back on duty at work. And if you look at the end of chapter 1, verse 11, that last verse, it says, for I was the king's cupbearer. So what is Nehemiah's job? What's Nehemiah's job description? He's a cupbearer. What's that? Well, you might think, well, he bears the cup. That's correct. But he takes the cup to the king, drinks of it to make sure there's no poison in it. If he doesn't fall down dead, it's good enough for the king, and then he hands it to the king. He's a poison interceptor. That's what a cupbearer is. Is Nehemiah a wall builder? Not that we know of. Is Nehemiah a leader? Well, he's a guy who can take the poison. I don't know that that makes him a leader of men. You know what I mean? Those are not the same job description. All right. When Ezra is introduced, we understand that Ezra has been studying God's law. He's learned in the ways of the law of Moses, that he's studied it quite a bit. He's a priest. That's not what we get on Nehemiah, is it? That's not in his dossier. His dossier is, I can take poison for the king. That's what I can do. I'm going to propose that he's not an expert on God's law. I got to put this down before I get ahead of myself. Okay. Let's continue the story. As we read through chapter 2, we see that in the 20th year there, month of Nisan, the cupbearer, Nehemiah, comes on duty. And it says, when wine was before him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad in his presence before. Therefore the king said to me, why is your face sad, since you are not sick? This is nothing but sorrow of heart. Apparently you can't grieve for 3 months and then it not kind of show up on that first day back on the job. Pretty natural. So I became dreadfully afraid. Why was he afraid? You ever been sad at work? I have. Nobody came up to me and made an accusation. You're sad today. This is nothing but sorrow of heart. Why would he be in trouble? You think about what the king is doing here when Nehemiah is on duty. He's eating, drinking. What about your lunch break? You like being sad on your lunch break? Or is it kind of a break? I don't know what the king was doing that morning, judging cases, trying to figure out a problem in his kingdom, writing law. I don't know what he was doing, but he probably wants a break. So now it's time to take a break, relax, take a deep breath, and the guy that hands you your wine looks like his best friend just died. It's really? What's going on with you? I don't know if there was a law that you shouldn't be sad in the presence of the king, but I know that it was distressing to the king. And when the king's upset, bad things happen. He could have said to Nehemiah, off with his head. Get this guy out of my sight. You can never be cupbearer again. He could have said a lot of things, but it's not good. He was dreadfully afraid. All right. He says in verse 3 to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad? So Nehemiah's well, it's too late now. I'm all in. So he's going to tell the king what the deal is. It takes a lot of courage. So why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste and its gates are burned with fire? Now right there are a lot of things the king could have said. Again, off with his head, get this man out of my presence. But the king says, what is your request? In other words, he says, all right, what do you want? What did Nehemiah do next? What did he do next? So I prayed to the God of heaven. I'm not going to be executed. There's hope. The king is actually asking me what I want. I watched a video one time of a guy who was trying to overcome his fear of rejection. And so to do this, he started practicing being rejected. So he goes up to the guard at his apartment. He's like, hey, can I borrow $100? And you can imagine the guy said no. But as he went back and watched the video, because he videoed himself doing this so he could analyze his own thought process and actions. And when the guy said no, he just ran away. But as he played the video back, he realized that the guard said, no, what do you want it for? And that next question from the guard is that really it's an invitation to explain yourself, isn't it? What do you need $100 for? If your wife is sick in the hospital and you have an emergency, maybe the answer would change. I don't know. No, why do you need $100? That's kind of the way I view this right here. The king makes this accusation. This is nothing but sorrow of heart. Nehemiah says, of course I'm sad. The city of the tombs of my fathers, my place where I belong, lies waste and in ruins. The gates are burned with fire. The walls are knocked over. Our people are in reproach and distress. And the king's response is, what do you want? And so Nehemiah prays to God. I'm imagining silently for wisdom. And then he tells the king what he wants, what would solve the problem. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. Do what? Okay, I don't think it escaped the king's attention. He is a captive, not a wall builder, not a leader, and not, he probably didn't know a lot about it, expert on God's law. But I don't think it escaped the king that this was not something that he was equipped to do. But he says, I want to go back and rebuild the wall. What is the king's response? Verse 6, then the king said to me, the queen also sitting beside him, how long will your journey be, and when will you return? So they set a date for him to check back in. Wow! And then Nehemiah goes on and asks for letters. Hey, I'm going to need some wood to build the wall. I'm going to need some stone to build the wall. Write letters that I can get through the provinces. I need permission from the governors. I need all the stuff to be able to do this. And the king grants it. How amazing is this story right now? Is that something that happens? That's just not a thing that happens, right? All right. And we're going to come back to that. This is not a thing that happens. And so Nehemiah recognizes God's actions through this. Okay. As Nehemiah comes to build the wall, let's look in chapter 4. There's this guy named Sanballat and this other guy named Tobiah. And they are basically enemies of the Jews. And they're ruling over the area. They're players in this region. And there's also another guy whose name I forgot. There it is. Well, anyway, there's also an Arab, and he may come into play in our story this morning as well. So there's 3 guys here. And so when they hear that the Jews are rebuilding the wall, they're upset because they don't like the Jews. They don't want them to rise to power. Let's just read a little bit here in chapter 4. So it happened when Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall that he was furious and very indignant, mocked the Jews. And he spoke before his brethren in the army of Samaria and said, what are these feeble Jews doing? Will they fortify themselves? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they complete it in a day? Will they revive the stones from the heaps of rubbish, stones that are burned? Now Tobiah the Ammonite was beside him, and he said, whatever they build, if even a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall. So now Nehemiah turns to God and cries out, hear, O God, for we are despised. Turn their reproach on their own heads and give them as plunder to a land of captivity. And so on and so forth. Verse 6, so we built the wall. And the entire wall was joined together up to half its height, for the people had a mind to work. So this is a landmark. This is a turning point. The wall is like half built. It's halfway up. In spite of this mocking that's being done against them. And then he goes on, verse 7, when Sanballat and Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were being restored and the gaps were beginning to be closed, that they became very angry. And all of them conspired together to come and attack Jerusalem and create confusion. Nevertheless, we made a prayer to our God, and because of them, we set a watch against them day and night. Then Judah said, so I take this to be like the whole people of Judah. This is kind of the consensus among God's people. The strength of the laborers is failing, and there is so much rubbish that we are not able to build the wall. And our adversaries said, they will neither know nor see anything till we come in their midst and kill them and cause the work to cease. So it was when the Jews who dwelt near them came, they told us 10 times, from whatever place you turn, that will be upon us. What's the picture being created here? We're all going to die, right? I mean, that's really it. They're going to come. They're going to attack us. You're not going to know where they're coming from. There's going to be a surprise. Why did the Jews who dwelt near these people tell them 10 times? You ever deal with somebody who just can't listen? Like, there's nothing that you can say to calm them down. They're so worked up. That's kind of the idea here. They just keep repeating it. Hey, they're going to come from whichever way you turn, they're going to kill you. All right? Problems on every side. All right. Therefore, verse 13, Nehemiah 4, verse 13, therefore I positioned men behind the lower parts of the wall at the openings, and I set the people according to their families with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said to the nobles and the rest of the people, do not be afraid of them. You think Nehemiah might be a little bit scared? We'll never know, because all that we hear is his words of courage. Don't be afraid of them, a voice of reason in the midst of fear. So far, I just want to point out, Nehemiah looks like a hero, right? He is the voice of reason in the midst of fear. He is the motivation. He is the one coming and getting everybody on the right track. He's a cupbearer. He's just the guy who dies when there's an assassination attempt on the king. That's it. As we read on down, in chapter 5, there were Jews who came and they said, we need food. Why should we die? Well, why did they need food? It wasn't because there was a famine in the land. It was because the nobles, those who were rich, were loaning them money and then foreclosing on their farms. Without farms, they can't grow food. They don't have food, and now they're working on the wall, maybe, but they don't have pay. They don't have food. They don't have farms. They're really at the end. Their children are going into slavery. They're selling their children into forced labor because they have to. They need money for food. That's where they're at. Nehemiah deals with this situation as well. In chapter 6, Sanballat, Tobiah, there it is, Geshem the Arab, and the rest of our enemies, they heard that they had rebuilt the wall. They finally finished the wall. And so they told Nehemiah, hey, we want a meeting with you. Let's meet together. Nehemiah says, I'm too busy with God's work to come out and meet with you. And then he finds out that really it was just a setup so they could kill him. Then, further on in chapter 6, I believe it's one of the priests, verse 10, afterward I came to the house of Shemaiah, the son of Delaiah, the son of Mehetabel, who was a secret informer. Well, that's nice. Now among God's people, there are secret informers who are informing the enemy everything that goes on so they can plan better. How wonderful. And he said, let us meet together in the house of God, within the temple, and let us close the doors of the temple. For they are coming to kill you. Indeed, at night they will come to kill you. Personal fear. There's an assassination attempt underway, and I'm letting you know about it. Let's go hide. Barricade yourself in the temple so they can't kill you. What does Nehemiah say? Verse 11, I said, should such a man as I flee? And who is there that such as I should go into the temple to save his life? I will not go in. This is Nehemiah's initial reaction. And then in verse 12 it says, then I perceived that God had not sent him at all, but that he pronounced this prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. For this reason he was hired, that I should be afraid and act that way and sin, so that they might have a cause for an evil report and they might reproach me. You talk about problems without and within, and there are more problems. What made Nehemiah the right man for the job? He's a captive. He's not a wall builder. He's not a leader. He's not even an expert on God's law. You remember he was deeply grieved? Remember, he prayed and fasted for 3 months because it hurt him personally that this city was in reproach and that they were going through difficult times. We see also that he was committed. Let's look at chapter 1 back a little bit. Chapter 1 and verse 11. He says, O Lord, I pray, please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name. And let your servant prosper this day, I pray, and grant him mercy in the sight of this man, for I was the king's cupbearer. So he already kind of anticipates something maybe going down with the king. He is committed. There is no quit in Nehemiah. I see that I read my note wrong. Let's go to chapter 2 there, a few verses down, and verse 2. Remember how the king said, this is nothing but sorrow of heart, and then his reply was, why shouldn't I have sorrow of heart? Because of all this evil that my people are going through. That's commitment. You know what I would have said right there at that point probably? Please forgive me, O Lord the King, O my Lord the King. I will have a happy face from now on because I don't want to die. He's not afraid of this confrontation, or if he is, he speaks up courageously in spite of it. He is committed. And then when the king says, what do you want? He doesn't say, well, if you could not kill me, that would be great. He says, I'm going to need some timber. I'm going to need some stones. I need a letter from you so I can go through the provinces and everybody knows I have authority to rebuild the walls. Wow, this guy is committed. He resisted distraction. We just read about so much distraction. He goes to rebuild the walls, and you know what he finds? That the work is difficult. The people have to hold a sword in one hand and work with the other because people are attacking them. But you know what else he finds? There are problems internally. The people's hearts are messed up. They're still rebelling against God. They're oppressing their brethren. And we'll see more of that later. He resisted all of these distractions. So we will build the wall. If people are attacking us, we will defend. If people are mocking us, we will ignore it. If there are problems within, we'll deal with the oppression, we'll come up with a solution and build the wall. He is focused. I want to point out lastly that he relied on God's strength. Do a quick survey with me. Chapter 1, verse 8. Remember, I pray, the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. And now look in verses 17 and 18. I don't know what that reference is supposed to be. There aren't 18 verses. I hate having the wrong reference in my notes. Let's look in chapter 2 and verse 8. He's talking about the letter that he's going to need to the keeper of the forest. But then at the end of that verse, notice that it says at the end of chapter 2 and verse 8, and the king granted them to me according to the good hand of my God upon me. Who does Nehemiah credit for the king saying, okay, you can rebuild a city that rebelled against a previous nation that we conquered? God. He said, God turned the king's heart in my favor. Now we can look at verses 17 and 18. Then I said to them, you see the distress we are in, how Jerusalem lies waste, its gates are burned with fire. Come, let us build the walls of Jerusalem that we may no longer be a reproach. He's talking to the other people who are already in Jerusalem. He's saying, rise up and build. And in verse 18, I told them of the hand of my God, which had been good upon me, and also the king's words that he had spoken to me. So they said, once they realized God is with Jeremiah in a very obvious way, they said, let us rise up and build. We're with you, Nehemiah. If I said Jeremiah a minute ago, I apologize. It's in my head. It keeps on messing me up. Nehemiah. Now let's look here in verse 20. So I answered and said to them, the God of heaven himself will prosper us, and we, his servants, will arise and build. Did he say, we are great wall builders? Our resume is lengthy. We have built many walls in the past. We have a track record going here. We are awesome. Did he say, under my leadership, you undisciplined mass of people will rise up and do something awesome for God because I am a great leader? Who does he credit? He says, God will do this thing, and we, his servants, are the ones he will accomplish it through. How awesome. He relies on God's strength. I want to exhaust this some more because this is the main theme of our lesson this morning. Look at chapter 4. You remember when Sanballat and Tobiah were making fun of them building the wall? Even a fox will tear it down. He says in verse 4, Hear, O our God. This is Nehemiah 4, verse 4. Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn their reproach on their own heads. You remember that part that I read a minute ago? Who did he say should turn their reproach on their own heads? God. Look at verse 10. Nope, not verse 10. Wrong note. Hang on, too many notes. Look at verse 9. Nevertheless, we made our prayer to our God. Who do they think will be a defense against this mockery? God. Now let's look at verse 15. And it happened when our enemies heard that it was known to us, that is, their secret attack was known to the Jews, that God had brought their plot to nothing, that all of us returned to work to the wall, everyone to his work. Who brought their plot to nothing? The advanced network of spies that had informed Nehemiah and allowed him to defend against the attack? God brought their plot to nothing. God did that. 19 through 23. Nope. Chapter 6 and verse 9. Sorry. Chapter 6 and verse 9. For they were all trying to make us afraid, saying, their hands will be weakened in the work, and it will not be done. Therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. What do you think you should do when you feel weak? When you feel insufficient, inadequate, unable, undertrained, not equipped, not good enough? What should you do? Oh God, strengthen my hands. Let's follow Nehemiah's example. That's right. Verse 16 says, and it happened when all of our enemies heard of it, and the nations around us saw these things. And I really should include verse 15. Chapter 6 and verse 15. The wall was finished on the 25th day of Elul in 52 days. This would be a feat for a well-trained, experienced body of wall builders. So it was done in 52 days. It happened, verse 16, when all our enemies heard of it, and when all the nations around us saw these things, that they were very disheartened in their own eyes, for they perceived that this work was done by Nehemiah, the great wall builder, and his well-trained crew, by these really strong men who are working on the wall all day long. You know, one man said he and his daughters worked on the wall in the front of his house. They were distracted. They had to have their swords strapped on, and while they were working, still 52 days. And the nations around saw what happened in Israel, and the nations around them had the perception that it was their God who did this work among them. Amen. Who did God choose to be his people? Does God always choose the mighty, the wise, the powerful to be his people? He tells us in Corinthians, not many of any of those categories. He chose captives to be his people He chose people who were distressed and reproached. He chose people who were oppressors. They were oppressing each other. You talk about infighting, this is like to the next level. He chose people who were allied with the surrounding culture. We read that they had intermarried and that their kids couldn't even speak the language of God's people. We read that they were intermingled with the surrounding culture. And Nehemiah says even Solomon was taken astray with this by marrying foreign wives and intermingling with other cultures. And really, if you look back at the history of Israel, Solomon was the one who first set up the most high places to offer incense to idols. But these people were also deeply grieved. They were in distress. They knew they needed help. They knew that if the enemy said, we're going to come and make a secret attack, they had better be afraid. They knew they were vulnerable. They also were committed and wouldn't quit. They had joy in spite of failure. Look at Nehemiah chapter, Nehemiah chapter 8, beginning in verse 9. They come together, the law is read, and the tears are falling from these people's eyes because they realize what great sinners they are. They're deeply grieved. Let me read verse 9. Nehemiah, who was governor, Ezra the priest and scribe, and the Levites who taught the people, said to all the people, "This day is holy to the Lord your God. Do not mourn nor weep." For all the people wept when they heard the words of the law. And then he said to them, "Go your way, eat the fat, drink the sweet, and send portions to those for whom nothing is prepared. For this day is holy to our Lord. Do not sorrow, for the joy of the Lord is your strength." So the Levites quieted all the people. It's good to realize that we are broken. It's good to realize that we're unable and that God is our strength. But we don't want to stop there. The Levites told the people, "Rejoice, the joy of the Lord is your strength." When you realize that God has enabled you to do the things in front of you, even when you don't feel like you're good enough or sufficient, there is joy there. There's a rejoicing that passes all understanding. And they relied on God's strength. We've looked at these scriptures throughout. Nehemiah realized it was God's help. The people realized it was God's help as well. And it was so obvious that, as we mentioned earlier, all the nations around knew it was God's work in them as well. Who has the ability? Well, I wanted to make that open so that we could say, well, Nehemiah had the ability. Well, the people had the ability. Well, the king had the ability to send those letters and authorize Nehemiah to do it and donate the stone and so on and so forth. But really, as we look throughout the story, it's pretty obvious. God is the one who is able, isn't he? It's not me. When we realize I can't do this, something big, something difficult is in front of us in our lives, I can't do this, I'm not good enough. Sometimes we're right, guys. That's just an observation on the truth. I'm not able. A lot of times, a lot of experts around us, and they can tell us, do this, do that. We can read a self-help book, watch videos, or like many videos, you can't just watch one, you need a spectrum, right? That's how video watching goes. But those experts can't live our lives for us. And often, there's something above and beyond any kind of advice that we need to get through this situation. We need to stand up and beg God for help and walk forward. We just have to lean on God, who has the ability, and walk forward, even though we don't know how. Other people can't do it for us. I'm a parent. Some of you guys are parents. What do you want to do for your kids? Don't do it for them. I don't think there's a single child in the world that learns to walk without somebody stooping down and taking that little hand in theirs. Why do we do that? They're going to learn to walk one way or the other. God has put it in them. That's how kids grow. They will learn to walk. We don't want them to fall. But I can't learn to walk for my child, and we can't go through trials for each other either. Now, we can be there and be strong for each other. We can encourage each other, and we should, but we can't. Nobody can do it for me. Even God will not come and do it for me. I wish somebody stronger would come along sometimes and just do it for me because I'm too weak. Sometimes I wish I could do something for someone else because I've been there before and I've done that and I know how to do it. I could just do it for them. It'd be so much easier. It doesn't work. It's God who gives the strength. Let's look at 2 Corinthians. As we turn to the New Testament, inspired by Nehemiah's story, look at 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. 2 Corinthians 3, beginning in verse 5. Not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think of anything as being from ourselves, but our sufficiency is from God. Who can do it? Who can make me sufficient and able and good enough to do it? It's only God. Let's see here. God is the one who gives the ability. You remember we read Nehemiah chapter 6 and verse 9? For they were trying to make us afraid, saying their hands will be weakened and the work, and it will not be done. What did Nehemiah say? Oh God, strengthen my hands. God is the one who trains us. Look at Philippians chapter 4, verse 12. Philippians 4 and verse 12. Paul says, I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. So Paul is writing to the Philippians in this particular part about how they have sent him help. They've sent him some financial aid probably, and he said, thank you. He said, but you know what? I know how to be hungry, and that's okay with me when I'm hungry. I know how to be full and how to feast, and I'm okay doing that too. How do you think Paul knew both how to be abased and how to abound? How do you think he learned that? He lived through it, didn't he? How did Nehemiah get trained by God? How did he do that? How did that happen? He went there and he lived through those situations, and God gave him the ability as he faced each new challenge. As I held my first child in my arms, I wasn't a good father. I wasn't hardly a father at all. As the child grew and it began to throw temper tantrums, I slowly, as I tried this technique and that thing and the other thing and looked in God's Word and prayed about it, I began to learn how to handle temper tantrums. And as my son rode his bike and fell off and scraped his knee and was hurt and distressed, I wasn't good at handling that the first time. You know how I became better at handling that? I did it. I lived through it. That's how. And after you do it several times, you learn it. You figure it out. How does God train us? The same way he trained Paul. He lets us be hungry. He lets us be full. And we learn how to handle these situations as we go through them and as we lean on his strength. Hebrews 12 talks about this. It says, in verse 6, "For whom the Lord loves, he chastens and scourges every son whom he receives." I thought Andy Cantrell did a great job describing fatherhood. Sometimes God lets us go through difficult things in order to train us. Sometimes he lets us go through difficult things in order to give us the strength to go through those kinds of things in the future. That's how we grow stronger, is by doing it. If you want to, any guys who want to build up their muscles know they're going to have to spend some time in the gym. Not because they love the gym. It's because you have to work out. You have to practice those muscles in order to make them stronger. It's the same way with the rest of life. And finally, God makes us sufficient. We read 2 Corinthians that God is the one who brings that sufficiency to us. Sometimes when we think we're not good enough, maybe we just don't realize that we are. And sometimes we're right. Sometimes we're not good enough. And how does God deal with that? I want to read Psalms to you. Psalm 23. Remember, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. Let's look down, though, in verse 4. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." Remember that part? Sometimes, to be able to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we have to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. And God helps us, makes us to walk beside still waters, lie down in green pastures. And a matter of fact, the psalmist goes on, David says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." That's after the valley of the shadow of death. He says, God is a good God. He provides for me. There's nothing that I need, but I walk through the valley of the shadow of death sometimes. And as God helps me every moment of that dark journey, I become able and sufficient and good enough, and my cup runs over, and I dwell in his house, and he blesses me through these times. The lesson is yours. If you need any help, we would love to help you. Come forward if you need to while we stand and sing.